A very pleasant good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to you all, wherever you may be at this time. Welcome to the Modern Japan History Association's roundtable discussion on Remaking Shogun, Historians Assess. And if you'd like to learn more about the Modern Japan History Association, you can visit our website at mjha.org. My name is Nick Kapoor. I'm an associate professor of Japanese history at Rutgers University, and it's my great honor to be serving as the moderator for this exciting event. Tonight, we have four extremely distinguished scholars with us, whom I will introduce in the order that they will be speaking. First, we have Professor Henry Smith, who's Professor Emeritus at Columbia University and previously taught at Princeton and UC Santa Barbara. His major research interests have included the cultural history of the city of Edo, later Tokyo, and the art and technology of Japanese woodblock prints. In connection with the latter topic, he's published on the woodblock prints of renowned artists like Hiroshige Hokusai and Kiyochika. And of course, most relevant to tonight's discussion, in 1980, he edited this very fascinating book called Learning from Shogun, which features a variety of essays on the historical background of the Shogun story and the ways in which it can be used in the classroom. And so Professor Smith has been thinking about Shogun from a historical perspective for a great many years now. And also go ahead and quickly plug two of his more recent projects. So the first is an exhibition that looks back at an earlier exhibition that Professor Smith worked on called Shinjuku, the Phenomenal City. And next year is the 50th anniversary of that exhibition. So a group of experts in urban history and architecture are planning a new exhibition at venues in Shinjuku itself that looks back on the original show, but also offers new ways of comprehending urban space in the digital age. And the other project is a new translation of the Kanada Hon Chushingura, which is a famous Bunraku play about the 47 Ronin, and that will be published next year by Hackett Publishing. And it's designed for use in teaching in Japanese history and literature. The translation is by Michael Brownstein of Notre Dame, but Professor Smith is the general editor, and so he'll be providing an explanatory introduction and a variety of supplementary resources. Our second speaker tonight will be Dr. Eleanor Hubbard. Dr. Hubbard is an independent scholar who has previously taught history at Harvard University and Princeton University. She is an expert on early modern England in global context, and she has written on a wide variety of topics, including the historical background of Shakespeare's The Taming of the Shrew and the radical political thought of pirates. Her first book, titled City Women, Money, Sex, and the Social Order in Early Modern London, made clever use of legal records to uncover the lives of women in early modern London that were otherwise left out of the historical record, and earned her the Society for the Study of Early Modern Women's Best Book Prize in 2013. In addition, she was co-editor of the edited volume Revolutionizing Politics, Culture, and Conflict in England, 1620 to 1660, which came out in 2021. And most relevant to our topic today, her most recent single-authored book is called Englishmen at Sea, Labor and Nation at the Dawn of Empire, 1750 to 1570 to 1630, which came out from Yale University Press also in 2021. And this book examines how the rise of capitalism and trading companies served to tame seamen who were previously considered pirates and plunderers, or sometimes not tame them. But at the same time, these sailors were able to extract a variety of concessions in exchange for their labor. And as part of this book, Professor Hubbard actually examines the case of the English seaman William Adams, who was the real life inspiration for the character of John Blackthorne in Shogun. And our third speaker today, who perhaps needs no introduction, is Mary Elizabeth Berry, who is the class of 1944 Professor of History Emerita at UC Berkeley. She is an expert on early modern Japan, and she has far too many publications to even count. But among many, many other things, she has published books in reverse chronological order on print culture in early modern Japan, the culture of the Onin War in 15th century Kyoto, and most relevant for tonight's discussion, Professor Berry wrote what is still the definitive political biography of the warlord Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who was the inspiration for the figure of the Taiko in the Shogun story. And in addition, she is currently researching and writing and thinking about the warlord Tokugawa Ieyasu, who of course is the inspiration for Toranaga in Shogun, as part of a larger book project on the economic history of 17th century Japan. And then our fourth speaker today is Morgan Patelka, Professor Patelka is the Bernard L. Herman Distinguished Professor of History and Asian Studies at UNC Chapel Hill. Professor Patelka is an expert on early modern Japan as well, with specific emphasis on material culture, environmental history, and urban history. Professor Patelka also has too many publications to count, but I'll mention that he has published a number of books on Japanese tea culture and visual culture and art. And his most recent book, Reading Medieval Ruins, Urban Life and Destruction in 16th Century Japan, received this year's honorable mention for the prestigious John Whitney Hall Prize. And then most relevant to today's discussion, in 2016, Professor Patelka published a book about Tokugawa Ieyasu and the connection between his activities and the circulation of art and tea paraphernalia in the lead up to the Battle of Sekigahara, which is mentioned at the end of the Shogun story. And like its title, this book is also very spectacular with lots of full color images of artwork, so you should definitely check it out. All right, thank you all for your patience, and without further ado, let's turn things over to Professor Henry Smith.
Thank you very much, Nick, for that nice introduction. As you have noted, I've been thinking and writing on and off about Clavell's novel for over 40 years now. And this evening, I'd like to focus not on the current TV series, but I'd like to hear people's thoughts about that, but rather on the broader pattern of the evolution of what I call the Shogun phenomenon. For me, it all began in the year 1980, when I was in the third year of teaching in my new job at UC Santa Barbara from the fall of 1977. As I usually have told this story to myself and everyone else, I became intrigued with Shogun because I noticed that enrollments in my courses in Japanese history had been suddenly increasing. And I quickly identified the cause as the huge popularity of Clavell's novel. The students told me this is why they were taking the course, which had been published in 1975, just 3 or 4 years earlier, and become a runaway bestseller in the meantime. I decided that the best approach was not to dismiss the novel as mere fiction, but to take the bull by the horns and take the novel seriously. So I used it in a course in the winter quarter of 1980, as I recalled, and the experience led me to invite a group of friends from various disciplines to join a workshop in May of that year, 1980, in Santa Barbara at that university, the result of which was the book that Nick has shown you, Learning from Shogun, published in October of the same year to coincide with the appearance of the first TV series entitled Shogun. My memory of those years is not great, and I have no archive of my teaching materials used at UCSB, but I became curious about exactly which course I used to bring the novel into the classroom, as I claim to have done. I was able to access in the online UCSB archives the annual course catalogs. It did not show the actual course schedules for each quarter, but it did give all the approved courses. And I was astonished to see that from my very first year at UCSB in 1977-78, I offered 2 introductory standard courses, surveys of Japanese history. One was called Japanese History Through Art and Literature, which is my true love. I remember it well, but it was listed as alternating with another course. This course was called The Samurai Tradition in Japanese History. And here's the course description. This course investigates the myths and realities of the traditional Japanese military elite, the samurai class, from its medieval origins to its impact on contemporary Japanese values, intended as a general introduction to Japanese history. This now means that I have to revise my entire story to admit that even before I'd even thought about Shogun, I was very interested in using the theme of the samurai as a way to provide, as I wrote, a general introduction to Japanese history. So the question is, where from and why did I get this idea? And in thinking it over, this is the last 2 or 3 days that I've finally started to penetrate the fog here, I've concluded that the answer must lie in the suicide of Mishima Yukio in October of 1970. I was then in my second year of teaching at Princeton and remember vividly what a shock it was. In particular, his choice of orthodox seppuku as his method, slitting the belly, followed by decapitation by a second. In the wake of Mishima's seppuku, there followed in quick succession a number of related publications. First came two biographies, John Nathan in 1971, followed by Henry Scott Stokes the following year, and in 1977, there was a translation of Mishima's Hagakure Nyumon by Katie Sparling under the title of The Way of the Samurai, Yukio Mishima on Hagakure. The original subtitle was, Hagakure Nyumon, Bushido wa Ikiteru. So this was what he declared in this publication of 1977. It was considerably earlier, of course. And in addition to Katie's translation of Hagakure Nyumon, it was also in 1971 that Donald Keene's translation of Kanade Huntu Shingura appeared for the first time, offering two detailed and evocative descriptions of seppuku. First by Enya Hangan, Asano in real life in Act 4, and then Hayano Kanpei in Act 6. So let me leave it at that. And I can only suggest that it would be revealing to compile a chronology of courses in the history of the samurai at American universities. I suspect I was one of the first, but I'm not sure of that at all. But I am somehow convinced that Mishima had something to do with that. It might be an interesting project for MJHA to compile a chronology of all such courses. I've checked online, there are at least a dozen that appear as being taught currently or recently, and I know lots of friends who have done this, including Greg Flugfelder, for example, at Columbia, who in the late 90s taught a very popular graduate seminar on the topic. At any rate, let me now completely shift gears to a few words about learning from Shogun itself. Nick has already showed you a copy. I will show you a copy again. I'm very proud of not only the book, but of the design by Mark Tribe, the designer, architecture specialist at the University of Berkeley, who is a good friend. It's a wonderfully designed book. At any rate, there are 8 authors, 3 historians, Ron Toby, Sandy Piercy in English history, and myself, 2 in literature, Susan Matisoff and Chieko Mulhern, 1 in religion, Bill Lafleur, and 2 who were taking a more anthropological approach, David Plath from the University of Illinois. 3 of these are from Illinois, Ron, Chieko, and Dave Plath, and Elgin Heinz, a specialist in cross-cultural teaching. So it was the latter approach of cross-cultural learning that framed the entire project and gave it its title. This was rooted in the personal experience of James Clavell himself, who, after a harsh experience in a Japanese prison camp at Changi in Singapore, depicted in his first novel of 1962, King Rat, would go on to become infatuated with the culture of his captors, replicated in the experience of the pilot John Blackthorne, whose instructor in cross-cultural learning would be the lovely daimyo wife, Mariko. So let me add only one personal observation that I made as a historian in the preface, observing that Clavell's attention to personal emotions might suggest that historians themselves take a more sensuous approach to ideas and institutions. And I cited the lament of the French historian Lucien Febvre, the founder of the Annales School, at least one of them, in the 1930s, in 1941, when he wrote, "We have no history of love. We have no history of death. We have no history of pity, nor of cruelty. We have no history of joy." in many ways, the last 4 decades have actually seen a decided turn toward precisely these sorts of history. Um, both in the history of emotions and sexuality and clothing and food, but we should place Clavell as sort of encouraging seeing these elements in Japanese culture. Um, so let me now shift gears completely to a wholly different topic, namely the choice of William Adams as the protagonist of Shogun. Eleanor will shortly be talking much more about the real William Adams, especially in his later years at the English factory in Hirado. But let me just reiterate the main theme of my own chapter in Learning from Shogun, entitled James Clavell and the Legend of the British Samurai, a story that I found of particular interest to me as a historian. Please read that chapter for the details, which are numerous, but it all starts with Clavell's assertion that, quotes, one afternoon in London, this is from a press release, one afternoon in London, he picked up one of his daughter Holly's school books and came upon an intriguing bit of history. It said, in 1600, an Englishman went to Japan and became a samurai. Clavell recalls, I knew nothing about Japanese history, so I thought I'd better start reading. In tracking the legend of the British samurai, I discovered that fully 5 novels had been written before Clavell. They're very interesting when you look at them. They have all the same themes of sexual relationships with a Japanese woman, a long sub-tradition in Western thought. And also, Clavell seems to have had no knowledge or interest whatsoever in these previous novels. But historically, they're rather interesting in showing that the legend of Will Adams, now he's called Will, he was never called Will historically, there is no evidence of that. But William became Will, a much more intimate type. And these I've read all of these novels. They're very interesting and quite different. At any rate, but for me, the most revealing historical development was the recasting of Adams, not as a samurai, but rather as the first Englishman in Japan, and as such a founding father of the worldwide British Empire coming from the East, preceding by 8 years the arrival of the British in India, coming from the West. The most explicit recognition of this role can be seen in the direct legacy of Adams in the forging of the Anglo-Japanese alliance of 1902, which came to be seen as his direct legacy. He was the first Englishman in Japan. In the meantime, the tombs of Adams and his wife, not down in Kyushu where they landed, but in Hemimura, where he settled and was given a fief, had been discovered in 1872, although progress to restoring them came only after the treaty in 1902. And in a speech at the Japan Society of London in 1904, the founder of the Japan Society, many years earlier, Arthur Diosi, gave a talk in memory of Will Adams. It's now Will. And he said, he lived in Japan for 20 years, attaining to a position of great influence and dignity, and died in the land where he had so well represented the best qualities of his race. The talk concluded by seeing the spirit of Will Adams looking down from his grave in the Bay of Yokosuka on the splendid battleships and cruisers that lie there flying the flag of the rising sun. It would be the following year that these same ships would go to war with Russia. Let me shift gears for one last time to a wholly different perspective on the broader Shogun phenomenon. And this is the remarkable spread of the popularity of the novel in Eastern Europe in the last days of the Soviet Empire. This all began for me in the fall of 2018 when I was attending a conference in London on Shunga, in connection with the groundbreaking exhibition of that genre in the British Museum. And at a reception, one of many, I was approached by a young student of Japanese history at SOAS who introduced himself as Radu Leka. I did not immediately realize that this was a Romanian name, Radu, R-A-D-U-L-E-C-A. But he told me that he was eager to report that he and several other Romanian students in Japanese studies were very interested in translating learning from Shogun into Romanian. I was frankly stunned by this unexpected proposal and simply said, sure, I would be very pleased at that. It took another several years, but it actually happened. And here I can show you. Can you see that? I'm not sure. Wait a minute. I'm not sure how, well, this is not showing up on my screen. At any rate, there is the book right here. It's a big fat book, Fat of the Learning from Shogun, entirely translated, every bit of it, by, I think it was 9 different authors. No, I think it was 10 different authors, each a separate Romanian. Japanese studies is booming in Romania. I had no idea. At any rate, in the meantime, so it actually happened. It came out in 2022, 2 years ago. I don't know how well it's done, but you know, what an amazing idea. So meanwhile, Radu himself, who now teaches at the Baptist University in Hong Kong, has done some impressive recent research on the publications of translations into other East European languages, including an interesting study of the cover designs of these various works. And what I discovered, he had a wonderful spreadsheet of all the different languages into which Shogun had been translated, and giving the year and the translators. It's a wonderful study. And so I was able to figure out a chronology that they began, Shogun was published in 1975. They began to appear in 1981, which is 1 year after the TV version, which may have had something to do with it. But it was translated first in 1981 into Slovenian and Turkish, in 1982, Yugoslavia, 1983, Bulgaria, and then sort of a break until we enter the period of the collapse of the Soviet Union, which may have been involved in it. The Romanian translation appeared in 1988. Their revolution would be the following year. After that, in 1971, Slovakia, and in 1992, Poland. 8 different European countries in quick succession had produced translations of Shogun in their own languages. I still find this an amazing phenomenon. I've talked to Radu about the obvious question of whether this popularity, which emerged, as I said, when these countries were breaking free of communist rule in and around 1989, and whether it might have had political implications, specifically of resistance to dictatorial rule. This is a complicated issue that I can't get into. There's some wonderful anecdotes about all this, but it appears that the novel was indeed opposed by communist regimes, so that the reading of it was in some way liberating. So this well-documented example of the spread of the Shogun phenomenon to Eastern Europe raises the question, the question of how the novel, as well as the TV versions, have fared in other languages and cultures. Just a second, cultures. Yeah, and so this well-documented example of the Shogun phenomenon in Eastern Europe raises the question of how well the novel had fared in other languages beyond its Anglophone regions. I notice Anglophone is a popular word these days to show what we do versus what the Japanese do. At any rate, it was quickly translated into the obvious Western European languages of French, Italian, and Spanish, and German. And I was told by a scholar of Japanese religion at Tel Aviv University, whom I met recently, the Shogun was very quickly translated into Hebrew and was hugely popular in Israel. But what about Arabic? And what about Indian languages other than English? What about Russian or Ukrainian? It may well be that its influence is wider and much more diverse than we have realized, and that we have been perhaps parochial in thinking about the Shogun phenomenon as Anglophone, as an Anglo-Saxon phenomenon. Finally, as a way of a postscript, I'd like to mention the fate of Clavell's second novel about Japan in his life work, known as the Asian Saga. I'm not sure when he christened it that. It came to a total of 6 volumes, described by the author as an effort, quote, tell the story of the Anglo-Saxon in Asia. The first was King Rat. After his experience as a Japanese prisoner of war, 2 are set in Hong Kong, the locale he knew by far the best, and 1, surprisingly, in Iran, the whirlwind of 1986. This is an outlier, really, by its setting, and a spin-off from Family Ties linked to his alter ego of Peter Marlowe, the protagonist of King Rat. But it was the 6th and final volume that he returned to Japan in Gaijin, Gai-Jin, published in 1993 and set in Japan in 1862 in the middle of the turmoil of the Bakumatsu period. It's right in the middle of the Bakumatsu as conventionally dated. It was poorly reviewed and enjoyed none of the success of Shogun, even though it was of identical length, really just within a few pages, and complexity. I've looked at it. It's classic Clavell. There's nothing wrong with it in that sense. Conversely, however, it lacked any of the exotic appeal of Shogun. Plans were made to turn it into another TV series, but these were aborted by problems with funding and by Clavell's own death in 1995, so it never came to the screen. But seen in broader historical perspective, this contrast makes it all the more clear that the choice of the year 1600 was absolutely crucial for the success of Shogun as a pivotal turning point, both in Japanese and in world history, as the year in which Japan turned from a nation at war, both internally and also abroad in Hideyoshi's invasion of Korea, to one of extended great peace, Taihei. As Toranaga puts it in a very evocative closing scene, he lays out his plans to go from his new base, Kaname, he calls it, his pivot place in Edo, to create a nation without war and an era of great peace. Ikusamonai, Taihei no Yo. By contrast, the shift from Tokugawa to Meiji, still called Toranaga, by the way, it's the Toranaga period, is in many ways a return to war. Both within Japan in the Boshin Civil War, often disregarded, but it was a major war within Japan, and then abroad with the conquest of Taiwan and successive wars with China and Russia. In this sense, Shogun, for all the violence that it represents in terms of the story, was a final shift in the direction of peace, of Taihei. I can only add that in my work now on Kanade Honshu Shingara, the concept of a great peace is essential to that particular play itself. It appears at the very beginning. It's set in the era of Taihei, ironically itself a period of tremendous war. But Helen McCullough said it was an era of pacification. And that's what really Japan, what Ieyasu's accomplishment was. Thank you very much. I'm afraid to have gone on for too long.
Thanks, Nick, for the introduction and for the invitation to speak here. It really is an honor and a pleasure. So, a central conceit of Shogun is that when John Blackthorne arrives in Japan, he's an upright and true-hearted Englishman, but full of provincial assumptions about food, bathing, sex, medicine, the superiority of the West, and so on. Assumptions which are challenged as he becomes more and more entangled in personal relationships and politics. He starts out fresh off the boat, arrogant, indignant, and as he slowly gains a better understanding of the sophistication and merits of Japanese culture, the audience does as well. From a storytelling view, this works beautifully. But Blackthorne's provincialism would not have been shared by the historical William Adams. Japan was very far away from England, and by the time Englishmen arrived there, they had been to a lot of other places around the globe first. So for them, cultural encounter was something that happened not once, but repeatedly. In Adams's case, we know that he worked for the Barbary Company for 12 years, which means that he would have spent a lot of time in Morocco. Morocco, then ruled by the Sultan Ahmad al-Mansur, was an English ally. Al-Mansur and Elizabeth shared common enemies in Spain and Portugal, and Morocco traded sugar, mostly, for English cloth and guns. No Englishman became a samurai, but Englishmen did serve as professional gunners in Moroccan armies in this period. So Adams would have been familiar with Islam. He would certainly have spoken lingua franca, and he might have spoken Arabic. And he would have learned in Morocco to watch his step and mind his manners and accommodate himself to the unfamiliar practices and customs of a formidable non-European civilization. He would not have been a country bumpkin. He also had a much more pleasant introduction to Japan than John Blackthorne. When the Liefde arrived in 1600, and also when the English ship Clove arrived in 1613, the ships were met by crowds of men and women who came on board from boats and were curious to see everything. The newcomers were treated well by local authorities. The Clove's captain, John Sarris's records are full of banquets, gift-giving, and musical performances. The view of Japan that emerges from these English sources is quite different from that of the miniseries, with its elegantly spare interiors, its meditative rituals, and its silent, self-effacing servants. Instead, it was a very lively place full of noisy children, crowds of people, festivals, frolics, plays, and prostitutes. At times, it was so noisy, Richard Cox complained, that it was hard to get a good night's sleep. Both the novel and the new miniseries push back against Eurocentrism by taking Japan seriously, but in other ways, they are much less enlightened, leaving out the rest of the non-European world and inflating the strength of the Spanish crown. For example, by attributing the poor condition of the Dutch ships to Spanish warships. The idea that the coasts of South America were regularly patrolled by Spanish warships is pure fantasy, just like the idea that Portuguese warships patrolled the route around the Cape of Good Hope. We should keep in mind that in this period, Spain could not even control the Strait of Gibraltar, which was right next door and only 8 miles wide. In fact, what doomed the Dutch ships, among other disasters, was the fact that they lost many men in an encounter with the Mapuche people of Chile, who killed William Adams's brother Thomas and denied the ships the food that they desperately needed to continue their voyage. However, I do really appreciate the way Shōgun presents the dueling accusations of piracy and nefarious plotting as Blackthorne and the Jesuits seek to turn Toranaga against one another. I've written about how the English worked hard to perform national trustworthiness and respectability for Asian audiences, where they were competing with other Europeans for the favor and toleration of local rulers, and where they were indeed impeded by their bad reputation as pirates, a reputation that unfortunately they richly deserved. The Portuguese certainly did accuse the English of piracy, and they did this not only in Japan, but also in Mughal India and Persia, wherever the English showed up when the Portuguese were already there. In turn, the English accused the Jesuits of scheming deviously to take power. And while these accusations were clearly instrumental, they may even have believed them. In England, fears of Jesuit plotting ran deep. What about the Dutch? Shōgun mostly ignores them, relegating the Dutch survivors of the fictional Erasmus to the roles of drunken louts, right? Foils for Blackthorne's moral, physical, and cultural superiority. This is blatant Anglocentrism and a serious deviation from the actual historical narrative. Among the Dutch survivors of the Liefde, one became an advisor to Ieyasu, one engaged in trade as a merchant in Nagasaki for a long career, and another helped to establish Dutch trade in Japan. But I have to say, I kind of like it, because in Asia in the early 17th century, the English did portray the Dutch as drunken louts. So in its own twisted way, by faithfully reproducing early modern English prejudices, Shogun is true to history. I also like the fact that the sailors of the Erasmus refused to follow Blackthorne. It's silly to have the Dutch seaman Solomon say that the sailors had wanted to turn back after getting through the Strait of Magellan, because since the Earth is round, heading east was the way home. But it is true that stranded sailors tended to reject the authority of their officers, and it's also true that for European sailors, low life in Japan had many attractions. When the first English ship arrived in Japan in 1613, the captain had a hard time stopping his sailors from straggling on shore, where, unused to hard alcohol, they got drunk, fought one another, patronized brothels and conjurers, forged relationships with local women, and ran away to Nagasaki. To understand why early modern Englishmen liked being in Japan so much, well, one thing I think that must have had something to do with it is that the climate was healthy, unlike other places that they went in Asia. But it's also helpful to understand that early modern England was a basically chaste society. And this isn't because English people disapproved of sex in general. According to their ideas about health and medicine, which were classical in origin, sex in moderation was good for you. Too much could dry a man out, but celibacy was unhealthy. Female virgins in particular were vulnerable to the disease of green sickness. That's a sickness we don't see too much anymore, but the best cure for it was marriage and regular intercourse. And in addition, female orgasm was considered necessary for conception, so early modern medical texts dealing with infertility talk quite frankly about foreplay. The problem with sex was that it produced babies. In the 16th century, the population of England was increasing rapidly, and population growth was accompanied by inflation, quickly rising poverty, and intense worries about how to manage the ever-increasing poor. The primary method of controlling population growth was the social norm that couples had to achieve financial independence before marriage. This meant that many people were never able to marry at all, something like 20% of the population, and that most people married comparatively late. Illegitimate births were taken seriously, both by magistrates and by neighbors who didn't want to have to pay taxes to support the resulting children. And on the whole, this approach seems to have been surprisingly effective. Only about 2% of births were recorded as being illegitimate. English sailors came then from a society in which their lack of clear access to women was linked to their subordinate social status and their inability to access the full privileges of manhood. So their enthusiastic interest in the women that their frustrated commanders described as whores should be taken as a sign of dissatisfaction with their native social structure rather than evidence for cultural chauvinism, which is the approach taken by Shogun, right? The brutish Dutch sailors cling to their European garb and refuse to learn Japanese even as they immerse themselves in the coarse pleasures of slum life. In fact, interest in cultural assimilation and sexual liberty could go hand in hand. In 1616, one such English sailor even tried to convert to quote-unquote paganism by shaving his head. He didn't succeed, but you have to give him credit for trying. Even Cosmo Jervis never goes quite that far.
So thank you all for tuning in, and particular thanks to Nick for making this event possible. I'm going to address 3 questions. 1, a showbiz question. Have we seen this movie before? 2, a historical question. What does the series get right? 3, a personal question. What did I learn from Shogun? I lack time for a 4th question. What makes the female characters so critical? I think Morgan will take part of that up. So, number 1, have we seen this movie before? Sure. The Godfather, mainly part 1. We have as lead actors Marlon Brando and Sanada Hiroyuki, whose sheer physical charisma transcends the action. Their facial muscles are more important than their lines, a point made to me by Susan Matisoff. We also have a focus on the inner circles of those characters rather than the big background dramas that drive the plots. We barely get to know the rivals of the Godfather, or Toranaga, while obsessing over intimate dramas. The lens is mainly telephoto. We are seriously inducted into those inner circles, moreover, through both the "you are there" use of subtitles in Italian and in Japanese, and almost anthropological elaborations of shared cultures. Both the mob and the Bushidan are governed by hierarchical codes of etiquette, by elaborate rituals on view at weddings and tea ceremonies, for example, and by variously creepy and compelling addictions to the arts, opera and no drama, for starters. Above all, we have a complacency in both worlds about stunning violence, a horse head in bed, an execution by boiling, and the unflinching sacrifice of insiders. The pursuit of advantage is lawless and disloyal. I could go on. I mentioned this symmetry between the mob and the Bushidan, between the Godfather and Shogun, to blunt judgments that Shogun plays to kinky stereotypes of Japan rather than canonical showbiz staples. The series is really good, I think, at selling a story that's intriguing in its alien detail without abject exoticism. Though I do wish that we could have lost the ninjas. Second, what's right about this series? The personalism of politics in Toranaga's Japan. And really, the personalism of politics in most places at most times. So there were about 190 daimyo when Hideyoshi died in 1598. But because most houses were internally divided between heirs, collaterals, major retainers, the parties to any post-Hideyoshi settlement were far more numerous. These many players sort of coalesced around Tokugawa Ieyasu and Ishida Mitsunari, but in weird and volatile and opportunistic alliances that created a mere illusion of sides for a fleeting moment. What Shogun gets right is the particularity of all motives behind those alignments, whether vengeance or material gain or hatred or self-preservation or whatever. Ideology is not a thing in this series. Toranaga stands for nothing. We see the characters choosing sides because of manifold personal interests. Yabushige, Omi, Saeki, Ochiba, Mariko, Blackthorne, each has distinctive compulsions. Yes, that was 1600. And anybody who's ever worked on Sekigahara has insanely unruly notes about unmanageable personal histories. The sides make no obvious sense. Third, what did I learn from Shogun? That Ieyasu remains a tough biographical subject, except maybe for the main thing. I'm currently writing about Ieyasu and Sekigahara, not so much the actual battle, a miserable affair, glorious for no one, and decisive only distantly in retrospect, but about the astonishing aftermath. It was then, in complex conditions, that Ieyasu remade the political geography of Japan through the mass attainder, transfer, a new vestiture of domains. This undertaking was historically unparalleled in scale, I think, before the age of revolutions. It was also the motor of early modern development in Japan. I have a lot of different thoughts about Hideyoshi these days. That book is, almost 45 years old, or anyway, over 40. Well, I want to make Ieyasu a personality in the story, partly because my sister Annie thinks that a story without a personality is unreadable, partly because conversations with Asao Naohiro around 1980 ring in my memory. At a time when we were all renouncing great man theories of history, Asao worried about effacing persons from ultimately human, not structural convulsions of change. But the person of Ieyasu is notoriously hard to recover from the documents. Can borrowing from Toranaga help? It's a stretch too far. Among the many fictions in what is, after all, a fictional series, the construction of Toranaga may be the biggest departure from the record. He is uncannily beautiful. Ieyasu was not. He is occasionally beguiling as he learns to dive or awards land to that fabulous brothel manager. Above all, he plays brilliant defense against Ishido, Ochiba, the Portuguese, when in fact Ieyasu played unrelenting offense in multiplying marital alliances, taking hostages, vesting property, planning battle. It's by flipping the record that the scriptwriters give us a screen hero we want to love. Except for the conclusion to episode 10, when Yabushige outs the vaulting ambition of Toranaga to suggest that everything we've seen of him has been a charade, a mask for the passion that consumes him. He does want to be shogun, of course, and at any price. Yes, that is Ieyasu, I think. He was rapaciously ready for power. Within 2 weeks of Sekigahara, he occupied Osaka Castle and began aggressive attainders of property. Within months, he appropriated major mines, minted coins, ordered work on major highways. Within a year, he put daimyo to work on his castles. Still, the man is elusive. He had no patience, alas, for the charades that made Toranaga so mesmerizing a companion for most of 10 hours. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Beth. And thank you before that to Eleanor and Henry for wonderful presentations. This is a very intimidating group of peers to present with. I also just want to acknowledge that the many friends and colleagues from across the world of Japanese studies on the call is also intimidating. The only person I don't see on this call is James Clavell himself. But thank you all for gathering, and I'm excited to hear some of your comments as well. I'll speak a little bit more extemporaneously about some of my observations. And maybe I'll talk a little more about history and a little bit less the show. I do really appreciate, as a teacher, the show's attention to what I'm thinking of as the cultural and social dynamics that constrain the actions of warrior leaders in the late 16th century. I think one of the great myths of the Age of Unification is that these warlords were almost like the embodiment of human will, that they remade the world in the way that they saw fit. And part of what I really appreciate about the show is the sense that even the consummate schemer Toranaga, there are so many contingencies that he relies on, right? That when he receives news of an event unfolding in Osaka, it changes his plans. When he receives the letter from Ochiba no Kata, he knows his plans will work, right? I mean, there's there's this sense that he can't go it alone. And I think that studying the warlords of the late 16th century, there is manifold evidence in all of the sources of highly networked individuals, of leaders who rule through constant negotiations and relationship mending, relationship building, through things that I like to talk about, like letter writing, like gift giving, social and cultural rituals like the tea ceremony, the performance of no drama. These were tools for maintaining the fabric of warrior society, and all of the successful warlords that we study and teach about, and that are here dramatically represented in such vivid form, are utterly dependent on their peers. And that I think that story is more interesting than the story of a heroic individual. So I'm really thrilled to see it told in this form. I also think that the show does an excellent job of foregrounding women as historical agents. These elite samurai women, wives, concubines, daughters, mothers, who, and I use those familial terms very deliberately, who often are understood through their relationship to powerful men, sometimes lose what we think of as the marker of subjectivity because their names are place markers, right, or indications of who they're married to. These women have tremendous influence and tremendous authority, and they shape decision making. They cause people to die or to live. They are culturally well educated, politically astute. Some are so good that it seems impossible they could have been real, and some seem to be downright evil, and everything in between, right? And a wonderful example of this, of course, is the aforementioned Ochiba no Kata, the kind of villain of the second half of the series, the mother of the heir, who is a representation of the historical figure often known as Cha-Cha, who was indeed, as in this dramatic version, the historical figure who was the real life consort to Hideyoshi, who bore him a son at the end of his life, and who managed very effectively to manipulate the many warlords who had sworn fealty to Hideyoshi and who were seemingly on the surface dedicated to upholding the kind of council of regents who would keep the peace until the heir came of age. She lived with the heir, the real life Cha-Cha, in Osaka Castle, of course, and I think successfully kept the Tokugawa at bay until 1614. And she came from an amazing lineage. She was the daughter of the warlord Azai Nagamasa, who the first unifier Oda Nobunaga had destroyed in 1573. She and her sisters survived numerous conflicts, entered into various relationships, were avid patrons of the arts, influenced their husbands and their husbands' command in various ways. And I think the point I want to make is that it goes without saying that these women are understudied, rarely written about, but wonderfully really brought to life in the novel, but here, especially in the show that is trying to decenter the William Adams character a little bit. So I think that for me will make this a useful resource for certain types of teaching. I do want to circle back to an issue that Beth raised and talked about in a really wonderful way, which is the kind of slipperiness of Ieyasu's character. Having worked very hard over a very long time to read everything that is attributed to Ieyasu and much of what other people claim to say about him at the time, I encountered this dilemma, which is that, of course, the documentary record from the late 16th and early 17th century is highly filtered and highly edited. It exists largely because those who lived after Ieyasu and his peers wanted certain texts to survive and presumably didn't want other texts to last. And so what we're presented with, I think, is a kind of eviscerated corpse of the presumably much richer and much broader documentary record from this era. And Ieyasu's interiority, his subjectivity, is barely legible. We can see that he loves falconry. We can see his increasing devotion to Buddhism as he gets older. We can see his love for his family, but also his determination to use them in this grand Go match that he's playing with all the other warrior leaders in Japan. But I mean, I agree with Beth. Sanada is I think brilliant in this role, and he brings Ieyasu to life. But I just want to say out loud that life is a fiction. That there is no evidence that most of the character and personality that this brilliant actor infuses his portrayal of Toranaga with has any relationship, in my opinion, to the historical record or to what we can glean about Tokugawa Ieyasu. That's fine, and that's, I can live with that. I think there are other characters in this period and in this moment whose stories are lively enough to deserve center stage or main page billing. The final point I want to make is that I've been trying to read as much of the available media about the series in Japanese as I can. A lot of the media attention is focusing really on how Sanada, as the star, but also as a kind of semi-producer, was able to insist on a level of historical authenticity that many Japanese flavored epics or Hollywood projects in the past have really decided not to bother with. And there's this triumphant tale of his rise mirroring in the Japanese media this notion that Americans or audiences overseas are more and more interested in, quote unquote, the real Japan. And Sanada is very happy to embrace this role and this mantle. What worries me a little bit is that amidst the rising is not quite the right word, the resurgent and seemingly soon to be victorious attempts to remilitarize Japan, going around Article 9 in the post-war constitution rather than revising it. When I hear Sanada say in an interview, and I'm not quoting exactly, but the gist of it was, Tokugawa Ieyasu created a government that ruled Japan peacefully for centuries. I wanted to play this role because we need heroes like that. I lose some of my enthusiasm for this production as a result. The Tokugawa Shogunate was many things, and all of us who studied the early modern period can find aspects of that society and culture and polity that we're really interested in and that we maybe even want to celebrate. But I don't think a military dictator who founded a military dictatorship needs to be worshipped in 2024, personally.